I'm Jack Israel Salzberg. I was born in a small town in Poland, Janów. We were 5 children, 3 brothers and 2 sisters. May 25th, 1923. From a religious point of view, we were an observant family. In Poland, it was considered Orthodox. However, my father and the whole family were very much inclined towards modern Zionism. So they differed in that respect a little bit from the ultra-Orthodox Jews. Went to grammar school. I was one of 2 Jewish boys in a class of approximately 30 children, all Polish. In 1935, my mother passed away on polio. At that time, my older sister was going to a university in Krakow, had to come back home to take care of the house, and my 2 older brothers left already the shtetl, small town, to the larger city of Będzin, right next to the German border. One of my brothers worked for an uncle in a very large enterprise, and the other one was very active in the religious Zionist movement, and also worked in Będzin. Conditions became very difficult after mother passed away. She was ill for 3 years, and it was a financial drain on the family. However, we did have some well-to-do members in the family, my father's side and my mother's side. And with their assistance, we moved away from the small town to Będzin in 1938, where I went to work for my uncle in the same enterprise that my father used to be a partner, and so did my father. My father never remarried. As a result, my older sister deferred her getting married in order to stay home and take care of the family. My younger sister was 5 years younger than I am. In 1939, when the war broke out, September the 3rd, the entire family fled the city of Będzin, but after 5 days the German army caught up with us. When the Germans entered Poland, and we were only 6 miles away from the border, they bypassed the area because they intended to preserve this industrial center totally undamaged for the German war effort and for the incorporation of the area into the German Reich. Our area was known as Silesia. That part belonged once to Germany before the First World War. And immediately upon the entrance of the German troops, they annexed that area to the German Reich. And we were not part of the general government as it was known in the rest of Poland. After 5 days, when the Germans caught up with us, we were returning home. The first and most important event to start with, when we came close to return to our city, we had to cross a major bridge near the town of Slavkov. About a mile and a half before the bridge, we were alerted by Poles and also some returning Jews that to cross the bridge is very dangerous because the German troops just select people and forcing them to jump from the bridge into the river. So we made a circumvention. Took us extra 2.5 days through forests and small villages to bypass the area. When we got back to the town of Będzin, we learned that the day the Germans arrived, which was Friday afternoon, the 3rd, the first thing they did is surround the area of the large synagogue, the main synagogue. They didn't permit any man, woman, or children to get out of their houses, and about 5 blocks were set afire. In addition, they captured about 200 people, mostly prominent citizens from all walks of life, religious, political, cultural, and took them as hostages to prison. Among them was my uncle. After 3 months in prison, my uncle died from blood infections caused by not being able to go to a toilet regularly. So we got back approximately the 14th or the 15th of September, 1939. We did go back to our home. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was lost. The Poles that lived in the house took care of the belongings. The first few months, life was marred by systematic raids by the Germans and capturing both young and older people in the streets for menial work, such as removing waste, garbage collection, and other kind of work that the Germans felt is not worthy of normal people to do. In the beginning of 1940, about 4 months after the war broke out, life began to return a little bit to normal. But the first thing the Germans did is organize a Judenrat, a Jewish autonomous administration. And it is well known in the history books that the man that was selected for our area, which were twin cities of Bengin and Sosnovitz, with a Jewish population of approximately 125,000. The name was Moses Merin, M-E-R-Y-N. He became known as one of the most shrewd and effective leaders dealing with the German Gestapo and the local German authorities. Rationing of food was immediately introduced, and in January of 1940, some of the more important areas of the city were prohibited to be both inhabited by Jews as well as Jews could not enter that area. It was called Judenbahn. Any Jew that had to work in that area had to be accompanied by either a Jewish militiaman or they organized in group on the border of that area under the patrol of German soldiers or police who would attend to their work. Life became, as I said, more organized, more stable, and it was in the early part of 1940, in spring, April, May, that the Germans started recruiting young men between 18 and 25 to labor camps. It was done in two fashions, either at night, just at random, coming to homes, or in the streets, capturing young people. I was subjected to at least 3 such raids, but because our business, my uncle's business, was taken over by a very prominent German who was one of the leaders of the German fifth column in Romania and Bessarabia, and he was well connected to the local German authorities. One of his closest friends and his boss of the entire German underground Nazi movement in Romania, a Professor Kuczynski, even though a Polish name, who was the head of the whole area and the special representative of Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS. Ostensibly, he was in charge of the foreign workers, Fremdvölkische Arbeitseinsatz, getting non-Germans to come to work in productive capacity for the German war machinery. On 3 different occasions, through his intervention, I was taken off the train not to go to the labor camp because I was considered a nützlicher Jude, a worthy Jew, a productive Jew.
What kind of thoughts were you having at that time when you were on the train, when you got off the train? Do you remember?
Well, on one occasion it was a very unique experience because there was a son of a very prominent leader in the Jewish community for whom the parents had offered a large amount of ransom because they really didn't know, and we didn't know, whether we're really going to labor camps or to slave labor camps. I was the only one taken off just before the train was ready to leave. And I had an awful feeling because I was singled out as a privileged person. And I would have rather at that time gone with many of my friends to the camp. But it was the German owner. At that time he was a Treuhänder, a trustee of the property. Subsequently, he was given the property when it was expropriated from my uncle. Intervened because he needed the manpower to conduct the business. That was a very unusual experience. It was the only time that I really wanted to go. On the other occasions, I wanted to be relieved. And I was the envy of many people, many parents whose sons had been taken away and for many months didn't know where they have gone. So the first year, 1940, was really a year of fair stability, except for properties being confiscated and the removing Jews from that very exclusive neighborhood in the city, which was not large, maybe 3-4 streets where the wealthy lived. We were subjected to some German police brutalities, but not in an organized fashion. The youth organizations continued to flourish, all Zionist and non-Zionist youth organizations, in so-called underground. But the Germans knew about the activities and didn't interfere. They let the affairs pretty well run by the Jewish administration, including the distribution of food, the allocation of work, allocation of housing. And then a German named Rossner, an industrialist, came to the area and with the cooperation and coordination of the Jewish leadership opened up a huge factory which ultimately employed over 25,000 people. It was the largest clothing manufacturer of military uniforms for the German army, even larger than anything that existed in Germany. Almost a third of the city of apartments were converted into shops. This gave the community quite of a stability. People were remunerated very modestly. They couldn't make a living out of it, but they were exempt from being deported to labor camps or any other work that the Germans may have felt they want to capture people for. Their families were almost indirectly protected from harassment or from any other movements such as losing housing or being forced to take in other people into their own apartments, people that had been deported from surrounding cities. The first city to be deported within a 35-mile radius was Auschwitz. It was known as Oświęcim. And our two communities, Benjamin and Sosnowitz, which were the closest and largest Jewish communities, have been asked and forced to absorb the entire population of Auschwitz. There were 15,000 Jewish families that were brought in to the two communities. So every small family had to take in a family. Larger families were exempt. And it became a little bit of a crowded situation in the first year of the occupation by the Germans. Early 1941, the Germans applied this systematic pressure of congesting the area and taking away more living area from the Jews, forcing them into fewer streets and into a smaller area. That started causing a substantial problem where 6, 8 people had to be living in one room. Medical problems arose, illnesses, hygienic problems. And then, as the Germans attacked Russia in 1941, food rations were cut almost 25%, forcing the creation of a major black market. And with the black market, Germans started arresting Jews in mass for violation of the economic regulations. And people were taken away to camps, totally unbeknown where they go. This was in late 41.
I guess I was wondering what the situation in your family was like at that time. Were you sick?
We were still in very good shape. My sister got married during the war in 1940, and she lived separately from us, and my oldest brother also got married, and he moved out of the house. And we were fortunate enough, we lived in an area which was not affected by housing restrictions, and we were really a pocket outside of the ghetto, about 15 families. It was a new area in the community, outside of the mainstream. And the Germans somehow overlooked that area and didn't evacuate us until much later. So we had decent housing, and one of my brothers, the middle-aged brother, left in early 1940 for Russia. Eastern Poland, smuggled himself through. He didn't want to remain under German occupation. And at first we had contact with him until the outbreak of the German-Russian war. We heard from him. He was first in coal mines in the Donetsk area, which is in the Ukraine, and then he was transferred to an area about 600 miles east of Moscow. And when the war broke out, of course, all communication was interrupted. But as I said, through 1941, life was still bearable. There were some families started losing people by being deported to an unknown area. It wasn't until the early part of 1942 that we began to hear about the existence of so-called resettlement camps. But the German propaganda, with the help of the Jewish Judenrat, the administration, attempted to diffuse the concern and really were able to convince people that people are going to be resettled into a new area for exclusive Jewish communities. This was in January, February of 1942. By April, the underground movement in the community, which was rather small at that time, but a hardcore of young Zionist women and men, learned from very reliable sources that Auschwitz has been activated as an extermination camp, that once people go there, they're being exterminated or killed. We did not know about the existence of crematoriums at that time, but we knew that once a person has been deported to Auschwitz, you never hear from them again. The next major event that took place in our community, in both communities, was in May of 1942. The Judenrat sent out a notice, both through broadcasts and house-to-house letters, that I believe on the 12th of May 1942, every man, woman, child healthy or sick, must report to the two main sports stadiums in the communities. It was considered a main tragedy. The rabbis in the community have called upon people to defy the order, not to take the sick on carts to and urged only healthy persons to go, and the rest should not leave their homes, even at the risk of being dragged out by force. We realized that a deal was made between the Judenrat, Mr. Marin, and the Gestapo to deliver a certain number of people for deportation. The final solution began to operate in our area. It also began to operate to a smaller extent in the general government area of Poland. And so about 40,000 people were hurdled into a main stadium, sports stadium, which normally would maybe accommodate no more than 10,000 people. It was the first time, as I mentioned, that the lay leaders, not affiliated with the Judenrat, and the religious leaders urged a boycott and defiance of the Jewish Judenrat.
What is you've mentioned the Judenrat in your area several times. What is your opinion of their role?
Well, in one area, Mr. Marin was definitely right, urging young people to volunteer for labor camps. Obviously, he knew that the best chance of survival would be in labor camps and not in the ghettos, that the ultimate fate of the people in the ghetto will be Auschwitz or Treblinka or Majdanek. I'm not a historian, but many of our young people from our area have survived because they did go to labor camps. And I would say that of Polish Jewry, as a percentage of the population, young people from Silesia, from our area, which ultimately had almost 250,000 people, had the greatest percentage of survivors. And had it not been for the German decision in 1945 to evacuate all of the labor camps in the hope that Germany will still win the war and they're going to need slave labor, a much greater number would have survived. In fact, more than 50% of inmates in those camps, most of them have been located in the eastern part of Germany, southeastern part of Germany, and the northeastern part of Germany. Had they been intact when the Russians liberated, several 100,000 people more would have survived, predominantly Polish Jews. More than 70% perished in the so-called evacuation marches or dead marches. I'll come to that later on. However, there are different opinions whether the cooperation was justified in light of the ultimate outcome. And so let me go back to the tragic day of 1942 in May. We stayed together, the whole family. My father, myself, my brother, his wife was pregnant, and my sister with a year and a half old baby. Her husband was taken to a labor camp. As we mingled around, and my younger sister, of course, she was at that time 11 years old, we heard all kinds of rumors. First, that women without husbands are being deported, are not being sent back to the community. Pregnant women, women with children without husbands, and elderly people. Now, as I mentioned before, my eldest brother and I were fortunate enough to work for this German who was very closely related to the top man, Professor Kuczynski, who was Himmler's personal representative in the area. And we learned that he is at the gate making decision who shall return to the ghetto and who shall be deported. I had gotten to know him personally, and so did my brother, because he frequently visited his colleague for whom we worked. In fact, on many occasions, if he needed certain things, he came through the German, not directly but indirectly to us, to procure for him, for his wife, a fur coat or a diamond. My brother-in-law was in the diamond business. They were jewelers. At one point, we were very anxious to bring my brother-in-law back home from the camp. And I must say, in retrospect, he urged not to do it. He urged us, in fact, if we can arrange for the sister with her baby to go and live in the camp, she should go with him. But we really didn't realize what his motive was and the explanation for it. And so about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I was most known to him. I was in front of the entire family, coming to the gate, the process of selection. And he single-handed stood at the gate with his thumb turning to the right and his pointing finger to the left. To the left, to the right was going back to the ghetto. To the left was quarantine for deportation. As I faced him, he recognized me very well. I showed him my identification that I am with Tremel, his friend working. He says, I remember. And he indicated the whole family should go back to the ghetto. But unfortunately, my father was the last in the row, somehow in that commingling. And one of the Jewish militiamen grabbed him and took him to the right. And we were separated instantaneously. The rest of us went back. But what happened logistic-wise, they did not have the facilities immediately to deport the people. So they emptied out 2 huge apartment complexes where the Jewish community was housed and took all of those people that they have identified to be deported to Auschwitz and keep them in those apartment houses for the next few days, because apparently they didn't have transportation equipment. We discovered in which of the buildings our father was. I'm cutting through a lot of details. We arranged with friends who were very active with my father in the Zionist organization, Mizrahi. There were 2 militiamen who worked underground for this organization, informing of all important events, anticipated raids, deportations. And we arranged for my father to jump from the 3rd floor. 3rd floor is really 4th floor in the old apartments. And we were there, my oldest brother and I, and the 2 militiamen. He jumped through the window, but unfortunately we couldn't catch him. He fell and he broke his leg. But we did save him from deportation. In the next 3 days, about 12,000 people, elderly people, sick people, pregnant women, or women without husbands, and with children, were deported. This was the first mass loss in our community. And the dark days really began. In July of 1942, 2 months later, we heard that all of our relatives in the little shtetl we were born that the entire community was removed to Treblinki, and that mass deportations are taking place in Poland, general government area, to Majdanek and Treblinki and Auschwitz. Immediately after the deportation was completed, the Germans began to plan to remove all of the entire Jewish population from the city of Bengin and Sosnowitz to a suburbia which was in the midst of development but had no water yet, no canalization, no sewers. It was interrupted with the outbreak of the war and completely away from the city. A scramble started, who was going to get what, an apartment and so on. It was a 5-month process. It was very tragic. They hurdled in 10, 12 people to a room. People were sleeping on the floors, 4 or 5 families in a 3-room apartment house. And so it began in 1943, in the early part, that they started within about a 6-week period to remove the entire ghetto to this new, very isolated area, an area that the Germans could very well control from the point of view of movement of people. But from that point of that deportation in May of 42, we had systematic and almost daily raids at night and in the daytime, capturing people. Even some of those that had passports or identification cards that are working for German enterprises that have been exempt heretofore, the whole families from deportation, they started breaking up families. Even though a person was employed, they did not hesitate to take the parents or one parent or brothers who were employed in other industries, both to labor camps and deportation. We've gotten to know more and more the way the Germans were working with the Judenrat. They were really demanding quotas. So many people had to be delivered so often. And Mr. Marion faced an unbelievable task. However, in his speeches, he was determined to save as many lives and to drag out as long as he could by maintaining the shops in the community. And he had the full support of the Germans, who for their own selfish interest didn't want to go to the front lines, maintained an administration of a lot of German people, and they lived very well in the community. They too worked with the Gestapo lobbying for maintaining these factories in the interest of supplying the most necessary, clothing, boots, shoes for the German army. And they were successful to a certain extent, but the pressure from the Gestapo was getting greater and greater, especially after the German defeat in Stalingrad, where the tide turned against the Germans on the Russian front. The SS started interfering with the local Gestapo and their policies in the various ghettos. The same thing happened in our ghetto. Hardly a week went by that they didn't have to deliver so many souls for Auschwitz. And then for the slightest little violation, people were no longer going to jail or to a correction facility in the area, but they had special vehicles equipped to take away in groups of 40, 50 to Auschwitz. It was only an hour's ride from our hometown, less than an hour's ride. Living conditions became almost untenable. Food rations were down to 400 calories a day per person. People were giving away clothing, their last belongings. People were removing gold teeth to buy food. Typhoid broke out, other illnesses. There was only one Jewish hospital which the Germans permitted to care for Jewish patients, and it was unbearable.
And what was happening in your own home at this time?
We were moved to the new area, to the new ghetto. My brother had at that time gotten married, so he had a little cubby hole with his 2 sister-in-laws and his wife, and my sister and her baby, and my father and my younger sister. They were in a 2-room place together with a cousin of ours and his wife and 2 daughters in 2 rooms. There was no room for me, so I moved out to an uncle of a girlfriend of mine, and there we lived. And he was one of the officials in the Judenrat. So we had a little better facility. So I lived with her uncle and her brother and a cousin and a wife and a child, about 9 people in 2 rooms. But very small rooms, no bathrooms, no running water. But my brother and I were still equipped with the identification cards, working for this well-known German, important guy, and we were not compelled to go out from the ghetto in the morning and come back under escort. We could freely move ourselves. We had individual identification cards. And there were a few people like this, and they were the envy of the community. It gave us also the opportunity to smuggle in food, because we were on the outside. We traded all kinds of things with Poles, and in business, doing favors, and even from Germans that we worked together with. We were able to get some food. So from a point of view of food supplies, we were still, our family, we still did well. My sister, whose husband left her quite a bit of wealth in terms of diamonds and other jewelry while he was in the camp, she was able to sell off. My father was still working in the business, so we all earned money. It was only a matter of being able to get in the black market the food supplies and being able to get it into the ghetto, which was one of the most impossible tasks. But my brother and I were fortunate enough to work for this very important German. We were able to smuggle in at a great risk. Many times if we were caught by the Jewish militia, because it was not the German guards that stood guard at the entrances to the ghetto. We had to share with them. If they caught us, if they showed that we had something on our body, but we were able to manage. But conditions were just horrible. Daily, hundreds of people were deported to Auschwitz directly. At one point, the Germans insisted that the orphanage house of 1,600 children be turned over for deportation. It was a big tragedy in the community. Several of the Jewish militiamen, one of whom is a friend of mine and a partner today, alerted community leaders in secret that at 4 o'clock in the morning the Germans planned to remove the entire orphanage of 1,600 children. They were able to remove about a half of them by midnight to private homes, and when the Germans came, they only found a half of the kids. Because of that, they executed 3 militiamen in public the day after. The next tragedy in our own family struck us on April 13, 1943. My brother and I were at work when a German Gestapo and an official of the criminal police came in, one of whom knew my brother, and put the handcuffs on. He says, I have to take you away. I stood there, totally devastated, and I had in my hands a crowbar. The instinct told me that I should attack the German, but somehow it was so swift, and he also had his hand in his pocket. I knew he had a gun, plus the fact that we were so well connected through this German that the instinct told me we're probably going to be able to save him, to take him out. The reason for his arrest was it was discovered that for 2 years long he was involved in an underground activity which resulted in supplying food to both Jewish underground but primarily to Polish underground, the liberal Polish underground, which did cooperate with Jews. And this was discovered in a raid. Some evidence, his name came up. And he was taken to prison. We immediately did everything that was humanly possible to try to save him. And we were assured, through a major bribe, that on the Tuesday, every Tuesday, these specially equipped buses that went directly to Auschwitz, they took out people from prisons, those that were condemned to go to Auschwitz, or those that were released. We were assured, through a major bribe, that my brother will be released on such and such a date. It was about 3 weeks after he was arrested. And unfortunately, he was not. He went to Auschwitz. Left his wife pregnant in the 7th month. And he was 30 years old. We learned later that a militiaman swapped him for a friend of his in the last second as they were moving out from the prison to the bus, pushed him into the bus and saved one of his friends, or maybe he got bribed to get somebody out. Anyway, it was gone. They went to Auschwitz. This was a real blow to the family. And the whole burden really of taking care of my father, my younger sister, my sister-in-law, my sister and her baby, fell on me, and there was only so much I can do, because I had to leave in the morning at 7 o'clock to work, get back by 5, and the Germans tightened the ring on the ghetto by the hour. It became almost impossible to get any food in. Other what I could consume outside and eat well, it was extremely difficult. So conditions became awful. My father stopped working after this happened in April, and he didn't go out anymore from the ghetto on the escort.
That was because of his grief, you mean? Or?
Yeah, he couldn't concentrate, and it became evident that it's a matter of days or hours. Life was such that everyone expected to be either captured in the next hour or the next day. We knew that there was very, very little hope. And people became resigned for the day to arrive, for life to end. There was no longer any organized life. The only thing that functioned is the administration. And they were helpless because everyone had a relative, and that relative had another relative that had a contact, and everyone wanted to do anything possible to better the lot, better life, and to survive. Some people were fortunate enough to be able to get false papers, passports, but there were so few that it made no impact. But the community began to dwindle radically. There was hardly a week going by that 500, 600, 800 people weren't deported. And also the mortality rate just went up tremendously. There were no medicine, there were no medical supplies. People just died because they were abandoned in the hospitals. And this was an hourly and daily occurrence. 2 months later, in June, the orders came to deport the entire ghetto. It was on the 22nd of June, 1943, that the Germans ordered all people out from their homes. This time they didn't trust the Jewish militia alone, they used SS and other personnel, really flushed out people from wherever they could. People were building bunkers, basements, all kinds of makeshift hiding places in the area under the worst circumstances. And they were flushing out people. It was a 3-day called selection, the gathering in one place, and the same method was used as in the sports stadiums. The same man was in charge of death and life. This time when I found my father, because we weren't living together, in this commingling, and found my younger sister. Fortunately, my older sister and her baby, which was at that time about 3 years old, 2.5 years old, they were not flushed out. They were in the same room where my father was. And a Jewish militiaman came in, who happens to be alive today. And I know him.
10 minutes. You have 10 more minutes.
That's all.
10 more minutes on this tape. Then we have another tape.
And he made a deal with my father. He says, if you come voluntarily, I'll leave your daughter and your grandchild. And so my father volunteered and my younger sister to step out from hiding. And they left my sister, my older sister, whose husband was in camp with the baby. I found my father and my sister, and I stood in front of Kuczynski. Again, recognized me. He says, the only thing I can do is keep you this time. I cannot keep your father, and I cannot keep your sister. And I was ordered to the right, and they were ordered to the left. And by a fortunate mistake, my sister was put on a different train than to Auschwitz. She was put on a train with women to a labor camp. The women realized, which I discovered later, that she is illegally there. But they hid her until they got to the camp. And in the camp, they pleaded after a while with the Germans, mostly women. It was a big textile factory in eastern Germany, in Peterswalda. And she survived that. Most of her friends are people 10, 15 years older. Some of them live in this community. And we received mail from her. My father went to Auschwitz the same day. And at that point, we became so resigned that I didn't want to go to work anymore. But I did get a call. The German came to the ghetto with a German policeman to find out why I'm not coming to work. They thought that maybe I was deported, but his best friend Kuczynski told him, Dein Jude, your Jew, wasn't deported. So I had no choice but to go back to work. But it was a matter of really there were left maybe 5,000 people in the ghetto out of the original 40,000. Now we had all the room and all the comfort. So my sister and her baby remained with my cousin and his wife and the children. We were attempting to try to get some papers to get us out. And through the effort of the Zionist organization, we were registered as citizens of Honduras. It was an organization out of Switzerland, Zionist organization that arranged for countries which did not have, which were not at war with Germany, for money, to issue passports, claiming that those people are citizens. About 2,700 people from our community over a period of about 8 months were recognized foreign citizens, mostly Central American countries and Latin American countries. And they were sent to an intern camp near the Swiss border in Friedrichshafen until the war was over, because there was no way of transporting them to their countries of origin. I have forgotten to bring my pictures, but we do have the pictures of the passport that was prepared for us. But in the last minute, the Jewish leadership, Marin and his leading group, wanted to have the same time of passports. And the decision, a conscious decision, was made by the Zionist leaders that these people, as collaborators, don't deserve. Even though they threatened to reveal to the Germans this entire operation, they were denied to get the visas. And they did reveal to the German Gestapo. The next transport of over 500 people went straight to Auschwitz. But those that were in the camp remained and survived. So we tore up our passports, our name was already there, and we were very concerned that they may seek us out. But fortunately, they didn't. We don't know why, but they didn't make an effort. So that was the last attempt we had made, and the last hope we had to get out from the ghetto, but it didn't materialize.
And how did you try to cope with having no hope? What does that mean to have no hope?
I think we really were reduced to non-humans anymore. It was total resignation. A few young people who remained in the community, were active in underground, made a bold attempt one day in the street and attacked 3 policemen and 1 Gestapo guy. They shot one. They captured 2 of them, executed them right there and then, and the other 6 escaped to Hungary. They had passports. They were active before that in a operation moving children and some young people, Zionist members of Zionist organizations, youth organizations, to Hungary, and from there to Palestine. But that was the last attempt of the resistance in our community, and they killed, I think, 2 or 3 of the leaders, and the rest of them fled. Those were the last days, really, of ghetto life. Do we still have on this tape time?
We have about a couple more minutes right now.
So, because I'd rather start on a new tape the next...
Keep going. Keep going.
So, I went back to work, and every day we were told that we can expect the final solution in our community. The German authorities who maintained those workshops attempted with everything they could to convince the Gestapo that they need those people to work in the factories. And as I said, there were about 5,000. Of the 5,000, probably 4,000 people, mostly young people, between 19 and 35, a few over 40 or 45, worked in those shops. It was really a skeleton crew. Production was dwindling. They didn't get the raw materials. And the Germans were suffering great defeats both on the Italian front. At that time, Italy broke away from Germany. And also on the Russian front, they were suffering tremendous casualties and defeats. and they let it go really on the Jewish ghettos. So life was very, very temporary at that point. We were living from hour to hour. At night we had vigilantes standing guard to see where the German troops are approaching the ghetto for the final every night, and the minute we saw, some people made false alarms. But one attempt was made in the last 6 weeks after June 22nd is we built frantically bunkers. We were so foolish, so the illusion was that the Germans are at the last moment of defeat. If we can only survive another 2-3 months. And so whatever we did, we gathered food, and we also lived with the illusion that once we survived the onslaught, the first attempt, storming by the Germans, that maybe we'll get out to the non-Jewish areas, smuggle out. It was foolish, but when you're desperate, you try to interpret hope into a reality or possibility. And we were trying to, as I said, we built in our own apartment where I lived, my girlfriend, her brother, her uncle, and her uncle's brother-in-law. We built out of a proposed bathroom, which was never finished, a very solid little bunker. It's the full size of a bathroom. We had solid walls, and we had a very well-conceived and concealed entrance to that room. It was foolish to believe that we can do it, but it worked. That in case of the Germans attacking the ghetto surrounding it, the first thing we'll do, we'll get into this bunker. So we arranged for, at all times, to have fresh water, because there were wells. We had to go out to the wells and get fresh water. There was no running water in those apartments, in these dwellings.